Hi, we continue in Luke 15 as the father and the prodigal son are reunited. But the son has simply recited the prepared speech he's given, and we don't know how he's experiencing the extravagant greeting of his father. So the father will do more this time. And then we'll see the elder son wander into the scene, hearing the sound of music and dancing. And next time we'll look at his response. I won't go back over all the pieces that I've been looking at since the introduction to this section, Luke 15:1 to 17:10. I really encourage you to go back and look at that. And I also won't go back over the things that I looked at to begin this passage. So if you're watching this video without looking at the first two about this story beginning 15:11, I really encourage you to go back that way. But a couple of quick summaries. As you can see on the right side of the screen, we're engaging the fact there are at least 4 different ways of reading this story, and we're looking at all of them simultaneously because there's evidence for each of them as we go. So one that we looked at near the beginning was as an allegory for the restoration of the two nations, styled as people, Ephraim and Judah, as the sons of Yahweh, and we see the Hebrew scripture references that make sense out of that. Another way is in the immediate context of the story, since the Pharisees and the scribes on the one hand and the tax collectors and sinners on the other are listening to Jesus tell this. In many ways, the Pharisees, as the law-abiding good boys, so to speak, are the elder son, and the tax collectors and sinners are like the younger son. Another way to look at that is economically. We saw in the first part how the younger son took the father's money and it divided the family up and divided the property up and left him with nothing. And we're going to see now that the father is giving him things, and you can see it on the left side of the screen, the robe, the ring, the sandals, and the fatted calf, and how that leads to unity and celebration, at least for those willing to enter into it. And then, of course, the broadest way, made famous by Henry Nouwen in his book, working with Rembrandt's famous painting, is as a story about God's infinite mercy and love, in which Nouwen and many of us, including myself, find ourselves at various times in life as each of the 3 main characters in the story. But again, one thing it's not about is that Jews are the law-abiders and Gentiles are the others. That has nothing in sight here in Luke's Gospel. So we've also been looking at the chiastic structure as built by Bailey, not a verbal chiasm, but a thematic chiasm, as you can see. And today we're going to look from 22 to 27 across the chiasm that ends with the celebration of the lost son who's found and begins the structure of the second half of that. As I've been pointing out, and I won't go through the details again, I encourage you again to go back and look at the previous videos, but we're continuing to see the parallels between this scene and the one that follows it with the shrewd manager. And we saw last time how they both had a soliloquy led to a plan, and now there's an issue of into the house. And in fact, it's really key in the story because the elder son hears the sound from the house, approaches the house, as you can see on the left side, but never enters into the house. And so the chiasm with his part, we'll see, ends open-ended. We've also been looking at key words, and I noted incorrectly last time that father and son and celebrate were primarily the key words, but also lost is a key word. And I missed a couple of them, so I'm reposting this chart at radicalbible.net because a couple of them are not translated that way. For example, here it had dying, and I noted last time that the word didn't literally mean dying, but could mean ruin. But in fact, it's the same word, lost. So this makes an odd translation. Here I am lost from of hunger, or lost from hunger. But it's the same word, and that's to highlight lost and found down here. So plainly the lost is the key issue there. And we'll see in a moment the various issues between the father and the elder son about how to think about and how to respond to the younger brother. So after the younger son has recited his speech, the father cut off the part of it where he planned to say, "Make me like one of your slaves." So we don't hear him say that. Instead, we hear this. And as my note below highlights, the father does not speak directly to the son, but to the slaves. And as Vincent notes, it's ambiguous whether the son omits his plan to be hired as a servant or whether the father interrupts him. Park, writing from a post-colonial perspective in Korea, notes that in Greco-Roman literary stories about rebellious sons, severe treatment is the typical response. And we saw that also from another author looking at Joseph Campbell-like myth stories, where it's expected the archetype of the father is the one who will chastise the rebellious son. So just like elder sons are supposed to be the ones who keep the younger sons in line, fathers are supposed to keep their children in line, and yet this father is the antagonist antithesis of that, as we've seen. So the father said to the slaves, and interestingly, the word here isn't slaves, it's paidon. I didn't note it here, but it is in this section. It is down here noted as paidon. It's a curious thing because often the New RSV, the translation I'm using, as you can see up here, translate the word for slave, doulos, as servant. And now it's translating a word for a young man or a boy, it's really like a boy, as a slave. And another one he translated as hired help. They translated as hired help the one that the younger son, the prodigal son, wanted to be made like. So different levels of subservience within the family. But in any event, it highlights this is a wealthy family. It has many hired help and it has many slaves, as we note here, called one of the slaves. This almost looks like it's going to be a chiasm around the slave and the fatted calf, but it doesn't quite form symmetry there as our last passage did. But there's certainly a parallel here between the beginning and the end. So quickly, bring out, and as you can see in this image, all these things, and they're all symbolic, and they also echo, as many things we've seen already, Joseph in the Genesis story. So, as Marshall notes, the stole here, the robe, stole in the Greek, is a status symbol, most likely the father's own robe, symbolizing total acceptance by the father and helping to avoid the village's condemnation. Which is to say, as soon as the people in town saw the prodigal son return, they might not be like the father, full of compassion and excitement. After all, it's not their personal son, it's the village's son who's disgraced them. And so they may come out name-calling or even rock-throwing at this son who dares to show his face here, having disgraced them all. And so by the father saying quickly, and this is the only time we hear the word taku for quickly anywhere in Luke, quickly bring out a robe is to shelter him in the father's symbol of authority here. It's not a royal robe, it's just a symbol of honor and of wealth. The best one in particular here, or literally the first one. And put it on him. So now he's protected from the potential wrath of the villagers or the city people, of whom we hear nothing. And I keep saying village because that's what many scholars assume, but I want to remember that it never says what the context of this is, whether it's a village or a city. We just hear about the house and the slaves. We don't even hear what the slaves do, if this is an agricultural estate or not, although there is an element of their being in the field, as we'll hear. So put a ring on his finger, a daktulion, only here in the New Testament, one of many words in this story that are only here in the New Testament, although 46 times in the Septuagint. And you can see examples there from Maccabees and Esther. And again, linking with Joseph, who gets the stole and the ring. But he also gets sandals on his feet. Hupodomata here, and we saw it earlier with John the Baptist saying, I'm not worthy to stoop down and untie the sandals of the one who's coming. We see it here in chapter 10 when Jesus sent them out not to bring sandals, to be dependent on their feet touching the ground. And then we see one other example of it later, when he recalls, when I sent you out without sandals, were you missing anything? So this is the only time we actually hear about somebody wearing sandals. And as my note from Marshall below says, the sign the person was a free man, not a slave. Even though the son didn't get to articulate what we heard in his mind, his make me like one of your hired help, which is not like a slave, but like an hourly worker. The father didn't hear that. In any event, he cuts off the possibility the son could be seen as lower class. Putting the sandals on his feet, we don't need to hear it's on the feet. The sandals imply on the feet, and even though this word for sandals, hupodomata, can refer to any kind of shoe, plainly they go on the feet. So the reference to feet is certainly meant to recall other examples of feet, especially the feet of Jesus, who are taken care of by a woman who's accused of being a sinner, who admits to being a sinner, but to be that kind of woman, as Simon the Pharisee says when she approaches Jesus. And so that reminds us of somebody else who came to somebody as a sinner. But there, her sins are forgiven because she expresses so much love. And we don't hear much love here from the prodigal. We just hear in his own head a plan to survive. And we don't hear any response to this any more than we heard a response to his father's greeting him and throwing himself on his neck. Further, he goes on, get the fatted calf, a very specific reference. It's 3 times in this scene in case we missed it. And it certainly references back to the fatted calf that Abraham has Sarah prepare for the visitors there, that anticipates the birth of Isaac. And certainly also the fatted calf, interestingly, the woman of Endor has prepared for Saul after she brings up Samuel, who tells him, you're going to die tomorrow. So it becomes Saul's last meal there in 1 Samuel 28. But this is not his last meal. This is the beginning of his new life. So kill the fatted calf, get the fatted calf and kill it, or to sacrifice it, indicating the liturgical nature of the party. It's not the normal word for kill, thusate, but sacrifice it. And let us eat and celebrate. Euphranthomene here, only in Luke among the Gospels, but 4 times in this scene, and we see it 2 other times, and interestingly, it will connect with the story of the rich man and Lazarus, not as celebrate as such, but what he does every day. He feasts sumptuously every day, and it's a word for feasting here. So what is clearly a once-in-a-lifetime celebration, this son of mine was dead and is found alive. Let's pull out all the stops and have the fatted calf. The anonymous man in chapter 16 does this every single day, and it doesn't say who he does it with. So let us eat and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. And that sets up what we're going to see, and I'll set it up now. We won't see it more till the next scene. We'll see half of it now and half in the next scene. A struggle over whether this is a restored son and brother. For it is to the Father, certainly. The son of mine was dead and is alive now, again. Notice he never says he's a son and he stopped being a son and became a son again. That was in the son's mind. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the Father doesn't go to the question of worthiness. He just goes to the question of dead and alive. He was dead and is alive. And notice there's no moral issue there. There's no sense that he was a bad boy and now he's good. There's no sense of metanoia. There's no sense that the son has turned around and gone from an evil path to a good path. It's simply from death to life, which has no moral element and seems to have no element of personal responsibility either, as if it just happened to him. But of course he made the choice. The word for is alive again, anazao, literally means alive again, and it's only one other time in the Bible, in Romans 7:9. And notice he repeats it: was dead and is found, is alive. I'm sorry, is dead and is alive, is lost and is found. Expressly parallel to the sheep coin parables. And they began to celebrate. And wouldn't that be nice if that was the end of the story? No, it wouldn't be nice, because we need to hear about the elder son, even though it doesn't have a happy ending within the story for him. So we'll continue one more verse here, or a couple more verses, I'm sorry, through 27, through the bottom of the screen here. So the structure you see down below is what we put up here, so you can see how this part follows a similar pattern. So the elder brother was in the field, and as Marshall notes, the elder brother theme is familiar from literature, and we've looked at that both from Greco-Roman literature and from others. But it's interesting to hear the perspective from 2 scholars who work with people in non-Western contexts. So Lopez, reporting on Colombian people reading the story, notes that they saw in the elder brother the social elite who refused to allow those who sided with the rebels in Colombia to return to society. In other words, they see it as they're the enforcers of the status quo. Similarly, Park, writing from Korea, likens the elder son's behavior to Koreans under Confucianism. The, quote, virtue of the hierarchical structure is the help it offers in ensuring the passive acceptance of the status quo by subordinates. So interestingly, both in a liberation theology perspective in Colombia and a post-colonial perspective in Korea, these 2 scholars report that locals see the elder son as basically the enforcer of the hierarchical unjust status quo. So we find the elder son was in the field, recalling Cain and Abel, but presumably, as my note has, performing supervisory functions over the workers, suggesting there is some kind of agricultural activity at work, but we never hear anything about crops or harvest or workers out there. So it's as if he was in the field by himself. And he came and approached the house, or literally got near. Notice how it's similar to the prodigal son. While he was still far off, the father ran to him. So now he's approaching the house, and he hears the sound of music and dancing. Notice he hears it through the house. He doesn't see anything because everybody's in the house. The word for music here, symphonia, like symphony, only here in the New Testament. In the Septuagint, it's in Daniel, where Daniel is in a royal context. And kloos here, the word for dancing, is also only here in the New Testament, 24 times in the Septuagint, and 2 interesting times. One is when Mishal, looking through the window, sees David dancing in the streets, and then is jealous of his exposure before the girls of the street and refuses to allow him into her bed again. And so a similar situation where someone sees dancing and refuses to participate. And the opposite in the Exodus story in 32, which is another calf and music and dancing, but the golden calf, not a fatted calf. So that's definitely not a similar story to this one. So he hears the music and dancing, and he called one of the slaves. Being an elder brother, he has authority over these slaves. And again, highlighting the word for slave is apaidon here. And as Bailey notes, it could also be a young village boy who would not be invited into the house with the adults to share in the celebration, but would be part of a gathering of boys in the courtyard. The fact that he calls the elder your father would not be done by a servant, refer to my master. And Duell, writing more recently in 2016, notes how the slave here is neutral in contrast with many other slaves in Luke who are active characters. But again, he's not a doulos like many of the others in the parables about slaves. So he called and asked what was going on, and he tells him, your brother, highlighting that point here, that he's introduced here as your brother, has come. And it literally means come, but echo in Luke always has eschatological overtones, although in the immediate story it does not. So there's some element of coming, like Jesus coming and God coming for judgment. And your father has killed the fatted calf, echoing what we already heard up here, because he has got him back safe and sound. And interestingly, the servant's report here is not the same as we heard from the father. His report was, the reason for it is, he was dead and now is alive, he was lost and is found. And he doesn't report exactly like that, but he says he got him back safe and sound. Hugia anta here, two other times in Luke, but interestingly only in the pastorals, the letters of Timothy and Titus in the New Testament, and in 3 John elsewhere. 48 times in the Septuagint, and half of those in one Tobit text. We won't get into that whole detail. Vincent suggests here he received him back whole, and noting that Bailey notes that Hugiano translates shalom from the Septuagint, indicating whole. So hence safe and sound, or he's whole now. And notice what we've seen. The money in the beginning, the mammon of injustice, divided them, and now he's restored. So that's the economic element of the story here, moving from one system of economics where greed and division divide money divide people, and another where the gift economy can connect them again. What will be the response of the elder son? Well, we can see already below he became angry and refused to go in. And what will the father do? We'll see that next time as our story comes to a conclusion. See you then. Bye-bye.